We are socialized, and I was socialized, we are socialized within the context of whatever environment we're in from really early childhood, starting probably with our family or caregivers, towards our training, our teaching, our education as children, then into the wider society with religions, we've got politics, we've got all these different beliefs which teach us how we should understand reality, how we should navigate the world. Something that learning about existential philosophy really taught me is that we are kind of inherently afraid of uncertainty, and we therefore seek answers externally rather than from within ourselves. And it's not a coincidence. I think we're very much socialized and trained to do that. But something that existential philosophy has taught me is that challenging and questioning where that information is coming from, why that information is coming to us, the way that it's sitting within us. It's so empowering. It's so enriching. It allows us to expand our horizons of understanding in a really, really, again, almost an infinite way, I think, to answer that. Questioning.
Okay, Natalie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Niall.
So to get started, why should somebody engage with philosophy? How can philosophy improve our quality of life, would you say?
Wow, that is that is such a big question, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And I think you've got philosophy as different concepts offered by different thinkers, and you've got philosophy as an attitude towards life, taking an existential philosophical attitude towards what it means to be yourself, what it means to exist in this world. And so I think there are many ways. There are kind of theoretical ways, but then it's what is that theory if we don't experience it, right? And so I think if we can find a way to reconnect with that curiosity and that philosophical attitude, which is so inherent within us as children, and apply that to our daily life in our adult world, then I think that there's just infinite, literally infinite value that can be had from that.
I really like that. And you've done a doctorate in existential psychotherapy, I think. How did engaging with those ideas in such depth over the course of those years, how did that improve your own quality of life, if at all? You know, what kind of effect did that have on you?
Wow. I think it's changed me irreversibly in so many different ways. And I think it's that questioning which, at least right now, is most important. I think we are socialized, and I was socialized, we are socialized within the context of whatever environment we're in from really early childhood, starting probably with our family or caregivers, towards our training, our teaching, our education as children, then into the wider society with religions, we've got politics, we've got all these different beliefs which teach us how we should understand reality, how we should navigate the world. And I think as human beings, we seek answers. Something that learning about existential philosophy really taught me is that we are kind of inherently afraid of uncertainty, and we therefore seek answers. And it feels, something that I've understood at least, is that we seem as a human species to idolize, to put into a godlike, superior authority position, um, anything or anyone, whether that's, a formal religion or whether that's somebody within our life. And maybe that taps into how we come into the world as very vulnerable infants that are looking up to a parent or a caregiver, to an authority. And it seems like we replicate that, we do that to the point that we seek answers externally rather than from within ourselves. And it's not a coincidence. I think we're very much socialized and trained to do that. But something that existential philosophy has taught me is that challenging and questioning where that information is coming from, why that information is coming to us, the way that it's sitting within us. It's so empowering, it's so enriching. It allows us to expand our horizons of understanding in a really, really, again, almost an infinite way, I think, to answer that. Questioning.
I love that. I love that. And sort of leaning into the uncertainty of life and not needing to have kind of a clear answer and just being okay with ambiguity and uncertainty, which is like, if you can do that, it just gives you so much more freedom, And I think whenever you were speaking, there's an example that came to mind for me in my own life was this is years ago. You probably don't remember this, but I was just about to start my master's in psychology. But at the same time, I was running the weekend university. And it was super busy at the time because we were doing live events in London. It was a lot of work. And I was telling you, I was like really anxious about this because like I don't know if I can manage both and all the rest. And you were just like, look, you're going to achieve nothing by worrying about this now, but you can sort of solve that problem whenever it happens or cross that bridge whenever it happens. And for me, just getting that insight from you, that was like, it's so simple, but I was I needed to hear it and it really helped. So yeah, I don't know if that was existential or not, but it was definitely very helpful. So thank you for that.
Well, I think anything can be existential, and I love that it's a reminder of how other people hold parts of our existence within them, that like how we impact people, and we might forget that impact, but other people. So I really appreciate you reminding me of that. I think often we hope to make a choice based on the right choice, right? But there isn't usually a choice with only advantages and zero disadvantages. So it's more about making a choice and being able to trust ourselves to overcome whatever kind of challenges might come with that choice, rather than putting ourselves in a place of limbo, in a place of non-movement, stuckness, and desperately hoping that a perfect choice will present itself. And it's when we are unable to be connected with ourselves and trust ourselves that I think it can be incredibly challenging and painful.
For sure, for sure. Like in my own experience, I have found that if I've made a wrong choice, it usually becomes apparent within a few days or a few weeks. And at that point, you usually are okay to sort of change course. There have been times where I've made a wrong choice and continued, and I've really regretted it. But there's also something to be said for kind of what you're saying there, like, a decision is made good or bad after the fact by the action that you take and by how you live in that decision, as opposed to like what happens before it. And I think that can be very, very freeing too. But I'm curious to ask Natalie, there's going to be people listening to this that have never actually, maybe heard of existential psychotherapy. And how would you describe it to someone hearing about this for the very first time? What is existential psychotherapy?
Existential psychotherapy. We've got, existential philosophy, existential psychotherapy, existential psychology, and I think existential psychotherapy starts with existential philosophies. Therapy being, therapy. I'm sure you've had many speakers which give a much more coherent idea of what therapy is, and ultimately, therapy for me, from an existential perspective, is just a unique meeting of two human beings, and they're bringing their reality, their experience of being themselves and existing in the world into the session, and I'm bringing my experience of myself and my experience of the world and my training in existential therapies into the environment. And that's the way that I see it. But I think the best way to describe existential psychotherapy is that it's it's an existential therapist is coming to that space, hopefully holding an existential attitude, a phenomenological, curious attitude towards whatever the client is bringing. But it's a really timely question, Noel, because within the field today, there is this movement which has, if we're looking at that transition from existential philosophies into existential therapies, into existential psychology, as in the science of existential philosophy or the application of existential philosophy, there is, in this moment, in this time, very, very new books coming out about how to apply these existential philosophies, which is a very interesting debate in itself, because part of existential philosophical attitude is inherently rebellious. It rebels against how-to systems, how-to authorities. And then you have science, which is very much how-to. And so the meeting of these places, each different existentially orientated philosopher or person that you spoke to might give a very different answer depending on where they're sitting within this framework, what their values are. Do they want existential approaches to kind of abide to the ideas of science and become a how-to, you know, or not? And so it's a very interesting and timely question, really.
So the whole sort of it's sort of built upon the idea that there is no rule book, and then there's some people saying here are the rules for the approach that has no rule book.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Okay. I love that. You mentioned there working, I can't even pronounce it, but phenomenologically. What does that mean, Natalie? Phenomenologically.
I won't give a dictionary definition because it would be better to just Google what does phenomenology mean. But for me, and an image that's often used to demonstrate what phenomenology means is this idea of an elephant. You can look at the elephant, let's say, head on, and you're just seeing the head of the elephant. And so if someone, let's say, an alien comes down and goes, "What is an elephant?" And all you've ever done is look head on to an elephant, then you would say an elephant is, and you would then describe that head on image. But to take a phenomenological attitude towards something is to realize that there's so much more than what you're looking at. It's to be able to walk around the elephant, as it were, metaphorically, to realize and observe and experience all of the different sides of it. And so we apply that beyond the elephant to life itself, or if we're looking at that in the context of working with clients, to the client situation. A client presents a problem from their perspective. You understand it from your perspective initially, but then together, if you're working existentially, phenomenologically in a therapeutic setting, you're saying how many other perspectives, whether that's looking from theory, from life experience, from imagination, from anything, how many other perspectives can we try to understand this challenge from? I think that's the best way to describe what is ultimately yet another very, intimidating, ostracizing, jargonistic term that is used within the philosophical and psychological disciplines.
I like this. So it seems like it's a very almost humble approach to psychotherapy. It's very open. You're sort of saying, okay, this is one perspective on the elephant, but there are five or six different perspectives that would be more helpful in this situation. So the therapist in this approach, they sort of like you have to be very conscious of what your own bias is, your own perspective is, and sort of bracket that and just be with whatever's happening and see what kind of comes up and see it must be very exploratory too, if that makes sense.
Absolutely exploratory and interesting what you say about bracketing bias, because I think especially traditional and introductory trainings in phenomenology do emphasize this idea of bracketing one's own biases. So being able to identify what your biases are, where you're coming from, how this is impacting the information being presented, whether that's in client work, whether that's in research. But I personally am more aligned with people who and ideas which are saying that's impossible. As a human being, it is absolutely impossible to bracket and fully put aside your subjective experiences or your biases or your insights and understandings of whatever this is. And so it's not so much about bracketing in the sense that it's suggested that we can completely put that to the side, but bringing that into your awareness, exploring that as a filter, but also alongside that, seeing what other lenses, what other perspectives are available to you.
Very cool. Very cool. And are there any existential philosophers in particular, Natalie, that you've really enjoyed learning from, or any that have had a big impact on you?
Yes.
End
But I
end of
guess a
answer.
longer answer. Yes. So I was trained in the British School of existential philosophies, and there's a handful of what I call the existential elite. So you've got these very particular classic names which are constantly referred to. You've got people like Sartre, you've got Heidegger, you've got Nietzsche, you've got Kierkegaard, and their work is absolutely influential to so much, not just of philosophy but of politics, of psychology, of how people today understand the world. There are phrases, for example, that Kierkegaard's leap of faith that we use in our everyday language. So yes, absolutely, this kind of European existential elite has been influential, but one of the reasons that they've been influential for me is when I went beyond accepting that they were the kind of the only or the main or the key figures that we should be looking at, and also challenging their ideas, because I think something that isn't brought into training often is the values of the thinkers who provided these ideas. And if we think about any idea that we're being exposed to, the values and beliefs embedded within those ideas are being passed on as we are thinking about these ideas. And so we cannot take these philosophers and their ideas without recognizing the context. These were very privileged, white, Western European males, predominantly, and these were the messages based in the particular attitudes in the particular time, often particularly in the second end of Second World War, right? This was where they were writing from, and also their actual ways of existing come out in their philosophies. Sartre talks about freedom a lot of the time as one of, one of the main themes that is related to Sartre's work. But Sartre was somebody who collaborated with Simone de Beauvoir to groom students, to take their virginity with great pleasure, to he was very much engaging with pedophiles movements and petitioned for their removal of the age of consent. You had Nietzsche's work, which is very inherently sexist. You had Heidegger's work, which was, very much embedded within the Nazi movement. And so I think it's always important to think about what the values and the personal choices and lifestyles of these thinkers were before we just accept their information as fact or as wonderful, which we are kind of often taught to do. And so that has been most influential actually for me, to look at this and then to go beyond that, to say what else was out there beyond what the existential kind of European elite were talking about. What else, what other global existential contributions were there?
So interesting. Particularly what you're saying there about, the values and the actions and the character of some of these people. Like Heidegger was apparently a card-carrying Nazi. Like this is not to be overlooked. And For me, it seems that whenever we're studying somebody's philosophy, we need to look at the fruit of it in their own life. And you look at Nietzsche's life, it was not a good existence. He went insane. And um, so I always wonder about these people that have these grand philosophies and stuff. Like, how are you actually living? How are you actually applying this? And it seems like there's quite a few of these existential philosophers were quite miserable. Not all of them, but it seems some of them were. I don't know. It's just an observation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why I emphasize, and when you asked, what is one of the most valuable contributions of existential philosophies to my life, is that questioning, right? Because I think we all need to be questioning anything that we're engaging with. Some people, we also need to be speaking about it to be able to question, because if we're not aware of this, if this isn't being trained as part of the training, then people are not aware, and it can be incredibly heartbreaking if you are somebody that's experienced let's say sexual violence, and you're choosing to put your existential research into sexual violence, and then you've been drawing naturally on one of the only females that's being shown to you, which is Simone de Beauvoir, and then you realize that her massive contribution towards the world of lived experience sexual violence of her students as she was, or sexual manipulation with her and Sartre. It's a heartbreaking experience, and so I think it's important to have these discussions so that people have that ability to question, to be able to choose. Some people then might make the choice of going, yeah, well, their actions were abhorrent, but their philosophies have great value, so I'm going to continue to engage with them. And some people might say, you know what, actually, they might have value, but there is so much else out there that I'd prefer to spend my time investing into looking at people whose character and lifestyles and choices are more aligned with my values.
Yeah, yeah, and this raises a very important point, I think. This idea of, we're sort of looking at all perspectives here, but this idea of being able to separate a person from their ideas and being able to engage with the ideas and get value from the ideas, even if the person has a flawed character or has done some questionable things. And there was one time I was with a couple of people, and we were talking about Harry Potter, and I was talking about how just the books were incredible or whatever, and just it made for such a fun childhood. And the person was like, I can't believe you would say that about Harry Potter after what J.K. Rowling said about trans people on Twitter. And I was just like, maybe she did, but it doesn't like ruin like this whole series of books that she wrote like 30 years ago. Like, like don't. So I think there is definitely a place for separating a person from their work and their ideas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always, again, important for us to reflect on why we might find it easier or harder to separate someone from their ideas. If our experience was of a trans person, for example, would it be so easy? Our experience was a victim of sexual violence, would it be so easier to say, Sartre, Beauvoir, that's fine. If we were ourselves or our family history part of the concentration camps, is it so easy to say, yeah, you know what, Heidegger, give him a free pass? And so I think, again, it's always important for us to consider why we're able to connect or disconnect, give a free pass or not give a free pass.
For sure. Yeah, I think there's definitely something to the idea of avoiding hero worship as much as you possibly can. Like for me, anytime I've had that, it's almost always been shattered. So for example, I listened to so much Alan Watts growing up, and like he really had a huge impact on my thinking. I used to think this guy just has it worked out. This guy is like a genius. This he must be so happy and so content. And then I found that he was an alcoholic, and like he was quite abusive to. I don't want to say he was abusive or not to his loved ones and stuff, because I can't prove that, but I read that online somewhere. And then also like Viktor Frankl, like an absolute hero in the existential field. In Irvin Yalom's biography, he talks about Frankl being quite, I think, quite ego-driven, which was a total shock to me as well. So it was just like a big reminder, like the people that you put on a pedestal, like they're human. So stop pedestalizing people, you know?
And it is such a great question, isn't it, Noel? Like, can we stop doing that as a human species? Can we stop putting people on pedestals, or is that just an inherent part of who we are? You know, it's really, really a massive question, and I think it can cause extreme uh, support and reassurance when we have someone on a pedestal. But as you're giving that example of, it can also be really, really shattering for us when we realize and see there every single human is simply a human being, and that includes many strengths, but also many flaws and vulnerabilities as well.
For sure. There's like there's a saying in Buddhism is like if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. And then in Christianity, it's like this whole idea like you should never have false idols and stuff. I think it's a similar kind of way of thinking. But with so existential philosophy and psychotherapy, am I right in saying they focus a lot on values? Is that right? Like what role do values play in this approach to reducing suffering with people?
I think there are many ways to answer that, but my intuitive response there is it brings values to the forefront. It brings our values into our awareness in maybe a more explicit, in a stronger way than we might live in our everyday life. I mean, every single moment of our existence, we are existing and in a way that reflects our values. Either we're doing that very consciously or we're doing that very passively. And I think there's something about the way that existential philosophies encourage us to question, encourage us to explore, that that allows us to tap into what are our values and where are they coming from. And I
Definitely.
think it's, yeah,
Sorry, go on. Was there something else there? That's okay.
no,
Okay. Have you thought much about your own, the values that are most important to you, Natalie?
yes. And it's a really it can be so confronting, can't it, when you realize what you value might not necessarily align with the people around you or the people that you've grown up with maybe or the people that you've admired. And so I've thought a lot about what values are important to me, and I think right now, I think it's also important to recognize that our values change throughout life, and that's a natural part of life. But I think what I value most right now is s- trying to silence voices, trying to recognize oppression within systems, trying to understand how different people are experiencing the world, and how collectively as a humanity we can try to really be aware of that and make a difference in a positive way um to other people. One way of that, for example, is representation, is being aware of how our different philosophies, psychologies are not representative of different voices and different experiences. So I think, I could speak for so long on values, but I think that is where my understanding of my values are right now.
Yeah. I think um what you're speaking like I think everybody's got different definitions of what these words mean to us. Like values for me are, I suppose, ways of being and acting in the world. Like it's like, yeah, so you can often say it as an adverb. So like Natalie spoke um uh empathically, or she listened compassionately, whatever. Like the adverb is often the value. And for you, like when I've interacted with you for what, it's probably 6, 7 years now, like, and for me, when I think, if I had to guess what like a way of being or value would be for you, is like thoughtful. Like I've never received an email from you that looks like it's been written in a rush. Like every communication from the very first one you sent me has been extremely thoughtful. So it's interesting how like that then has an effect on people. Because say I do get an email from you that's written from that state of mind, then that then influences how I communicate with people for the rest of the day. So it's sort of like it's a real, I think our ways of being and our values kind of flow into each other, and they create a very they create our social context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love that as an example. That's really sweet to recognize that, and to have that kind of feedback. And I think it's such an important point you make of the values that we hold and uphold influence the way that we show up in the world, and the way that we show up in the world cannot not why choose a double negative there, I don't know, but the way that we show up in the world naturally, inescapably impacts the people in our world. And it's everything is a ripple. We are so interconnected, and I think it's so important for us to really hold that in mind in everything that we do. The difference between thanking someone who's just done us a favor or not thanking them, difference that's smiling someone as we pass on the street and we're not smiling at them. Like every single action that we take is value driven, and every single action that we take impacts the world, impacts the other people.
100%. I think maybe one of the most beneficial habits I've got into in recently is, before I'm about to do something, like say it's like, I don't know, like reply to emails or plan a project or whatever, like I'll just ask myself, like I'll literally open a note on my computer and be like, what values do I want to embody as I do this work? And I'll just list out the things, like whether it's patience or clarity or enjoying the process or whatever. And just by doing that, it's something like it like primes my brain, and I just slow down, and I'm like, I'm not so like anxious. I'm like just like, right, just take your time, enjoy it. And things seem to go well when I take that approach. Whereas if I don't, I can very easily just like, I'm all over the place. Um, but anyway, you go on all day. Um, a person told me in an interview yesterday, actually, that all philosophy should come with a warning label. Do you think this is true of existential philosophy? And if so, are there any potential negative effects of going deep in existential philosophy? And if nothing comes to mind, don't worry.
No, no, I would definitely agree with that, because questioning is power. Knowledge is power, and questioning is powerful. And if that is, I think it, no, sorry, I really feel passionately about this, and I'm so glad that you asked. I think it should come with a warning, and we should be careful with the way that we engage with it, because if we are engaging with philosophical ideas, questioning the big questions in life, what does it mean to exist? Am I free? Am I not free? Am I, all of these massive questions in life. If we're doing that within an environment that is just kind of casual, or just a bit curious, and then we're leaving those thoughts behind as we go and start whatever next activity we've got in the day, or if we're doing that within a community of like-minded people whose, you've just spoken about, values, whose values align with us, then it's a very different experience to if we are sitting in a place of suffering, in a place of lostness, in a place of despair, and we are by ourselves, and we are going down these massive rabbit holes of our own thoughts, or our access to the information of the world, and it can generate and cause so much suffering. And this is almost ironically something that it comes up in therapy with some clients who find themselves to their way to an existential therapist because of an absolute despairing relationship with philosophy. So I would agree it should come with a warning.
Okay, good to know. Good to know.
But
Um,
just to emphasize there, I think the key message is it's so important to be surrounded by people who are aligned with you, who can support you in these big questioning ideas, rather than it just become your own echo chamber.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. That's probably a fast track to insanity, I would say, as Nietzsche showed us. How does existential thinking, philosophy, psychology link with, let's say, things like religion and spirituality? How is it compatible? Is it you sort of saying yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think religion and science and philosophy have a very interesting and at times quite sinister history together. I think it comes back to what we were speaking about earlier in terms of this innate questioning, this innate yearning for answers that human beings have. And I feel that, and I don't know, I wasn't back in time, I don't have a time machine or anything like this, but I think um religion was such a huge force of providing answers, whatever religion that is, wherever in the world that was from, throughout history. Religion has been such a strong source of providing answers and being the authority and giving the yes or no, this is how you should exist, this is how you shouldn't exist. And while religion is very much prevalent today, we also have its kind of very young in the scheme of things companion of science, which sometimes they're compatible, sometimes they're completely incompatible. But ultimately, science is also another force of providing answers. And when it comes to psychology and we have, I think often a helpful example to use is sexuality and homosexuality. So we have religions that are saying this is a sin, and we also have psychology has completely changed its way of understanding sexuality and, for example, homosexuality. So in the early diagnostic manual in 1952, homosexuality was understood as a sociopathic personality disturbance. And that was changed in 1973 when it was called a sexual orientation disturbance. And it was only removed, homosexuality was only removed from the diagnostic manual in 1986. And I give that one example because I think it's really important for us to realize that we must question what science is telling us as if it's fact. Even something like psychology, it's inherently mirroring the values of the time, and it always will. And I think it's very easy to say research says this and to say that is a fact, but research has said that, for example, homosexuality is a disturbance, is a disease, and many different others. I use that just as one example. And so I think looking at the way that religion and science and psychology have grown up together in a way to trying to provide answers. Um, Philosophy has its value in saying let's just question that, right? But also, as we've spoken about already, realizing that philosophy too has its own values embedded in it.
Hmm. That's such a powerful example, actually, and just such a good reminder that even if something has research backing, it does not necessarily mean it's true. And I think in the modern world, whenever somebody says research says or studies show, people just immediately turn off their critical thinking faculty. And that's like, yeah, maybe one study has shown that, but there's probably 50 on the other side that show a different point of view, you know. So such a good point. I see a question I was curious to ask you, Natalie. Is it like I'm aware that some existential thinkers sort of have this idea that reality is at its ground or at its base sort of meaningless, but it's sort of up to us to kind of make our own meaning within that context. Is that a general view shared by most existential philosophers, or is that like a small subset that sort of have that way of thinking? Or yeah,
I the classic phrase that comes to mind there is Sartre's existence precedes essence. So we exist and then we form the essence of who we are. Um, I think you're asking, is that a general shared understanding of all existential philosophies?
yeah, the idea that big
Life is
picture
meaningless.
reality, life is meaningless, but it's kind of up to us as human, as meaning making creatures to sort of make our own meaning up within within this context. Is that something that's shared across the board, or is it because like Paul Tillich, for example, he was a spiritual person, but he was an existentialist. So maybe it's not universal.
Right, and Kierkegaard was also religious as well, and I think it's there are shared insights. I think it's a common one. Let's say like it's a common one that would say life is there is no predetermined meaning to life, and so therefore it's up to us to create meaning for ourselves. I think that there is something that is commonly shared between many existential philosophies. But like you say, there are different interpretations of what that means, of how that looks, of our freedom to be able to do that. And I think looking, for example, at, let's say, Black and Afrikaner existentialism, the idea of being able to just freely create ourselves is, for example, if we're looking at philosophers um, exploring the lived experience of enslaved people, it's going to be a very different experience to claim your identity and create your existence and to find meaning when you are existing in the eyes of the slave owning others as a human being, when your human being and your humanness has been de-existentialized, has been dehumanized, in contrast to someone like Sartre living in bourgeoisie Paris saying, oh, we should all be free, we should do what we want, we it's our responsibility to live authentically and to be free. And so I think, yeah, it might be quite a shared a shared theme, but the way that different existential philosophies engage in that theme is different.
Yeah, no, such a good point. And just going back to what you were saying about sort of creating meaning, or I'm not sure that was the exact phrase you used, but the quote from Viktor Frankl was something like someone you shouldn't ask what the meaning of what the meaning of life is. You should realize that it's you're the person being asked, and you can only answer by answering for your own life and by being responsible, by responding appropriately to the current situation, the current context you find yourself in. And I think that's a very empowering way to look at the world, because you realize, okay, life is asking a question of me. How do I respond within my context? Because this is ultimately what I'm here to do, you know? Um, so now, like, can you tell us about your healings acronym for applying existential thinking to sort of helping people to reduce suffering?
Yes, absolutely. So it's in early days, but when you invited me here, I thought it would be a really nice place for it to make its debut. And as you say, I'm kind of my background, my training, my current work is very much working with suffering, working with trauma within the context of therapy and within the context of research. And something that has come up for me as I'm writing this book at the moment is like you say, this acronym of healings, which draws on different experiences that I've discovered from my client work, and different philosophies of existence, global philosophies of existence. And the idea of the acronym is to expand on these themes to understand what it means to suffer and how we can heal from that suffering. And I'm not going to go into massive amounts of detail, partly because it's something I'm still exploring myself, but I think there are some questions related to this that can be really, really helpful for us to ask ourselves and can apply to most any situation as a way to really tap into that curiosity, tap into that philosophical attitude towards our experience and help us to navigate. And so the acronym healings, we start with H, which refers to help or hurt. And the basic question is this hurting or is this helping me? So is this thought, is this emotion, is this choice, is this person, is it hurting me or is it helping me? And leading to this kind of questions of what can I do about it? So E refers to equilibrium or extreme. And the question that can accompany that is this, thought, choice, feeling, person, is it balanced or is it extreme? And we know that when we can find more balance and feel more balanced, we're coming from a very different place than if we are feeling very intense or in an extreme state. The A represents awareness or asleep, and this is related to the question of what am I focused on and what am I missing? Because often we can be living on autopilot. We can be thinking that we are having a choice and an agency over how we're navigating our life, but really we're being very passive in it, and we're having all of our awareness focused on a particular thing that might be causing us suffering and feeling like we can't escape from that. The L refers to love or lost. So am I coming from a place of love? Or when we think about love, what a massive word. So I think each of us again have to think about what that means for ourselves. But what I've really understood, and even a client today really helped to emphasize this: love is such an expansive experience in contrast to hate, which can be so blocking, so limiting, so stuck, and we can really get lost in this place. So if we are coming from a place of love, whether that's in our thoughts towards ourselves, our thoughts towards others, the way that we're treating ourselves, the way that we're treating others, we're going to have a very different experience of life than if we're coming from a place of lost in this kind of hateful or judgmental way of thinking. The I, it stands for interested or ignorant. And the question relates to, am I being curious or am I being biased? I think we can be really, really, really interested and fascinated by our pain, for example. And if we're being curious about what else exists, what we might be ignoring other than our pain, then it can be leading to a really great place of freedom. But if we're just really fixated, naturally so, because it's hurting us, it's something that is often unbearable. If we're purely focusing on our pain, then we are really in a stuck place, and not in that, as we were saying, that phenomenological way of seeing the wider picture. What else is going on in life? Even when we're really, really hurting, what else can be available to us that can alleviate our pain and remind us that there's more going on out there? The N refers to now or nowhere. And this is relating to, am I being present or am I disconnected? We know that we have very little control of things when we're numbing from it. Sometimes we choose to numb ourselves from life situations because it's too painful, because our suffering is too great. But when we can be present, even though it is so painful sometimes, so confronting sometimes, this is where we have more power for change, for transcending, to meet our potential, to see our possibilities. The G refers to generous or greedy. Am I being generous? Am I giving everything equal energy? Or am I being greedy? For example, am I hoarding memories? Am I hoarding my pain? If we're hoarding that, then it's going to be overwhelming us. We're going to be overwhelmed by that. But if we're able to share that, if we're we're able to find a safe space, or whether that's a person or a journal or a meditation or yeah, walking in nature, we are able to release that. We are able to let go of that. And finally, which I think is most important, safe or scared. Uh, is this situation feeling safe for me, or is it making me feel scared? Because we are so programmed to respond to threat. And as we know, the more times we are experiencing trauma and threat, the more hypersensitive we are to navigating from that place of trauma and threat. And I think all of these are kind of theoretical in our mind, but also they relate to how we feel them within our body. So that is a very brief overview of a very kind of new in the making idea, which I appreciate you giving me space to talk about, Niall.
That was beautiful, Natalie, and immensely practical too. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm excited to see where that goes. Before we wrap up, can you tell us about the Existential Summit that you organize and uh like what does it involve? Where can people find it online? When is it? Can you tell us a little bit about the summit?
Yes, and I can't start talking about the summit without talking about you, Niall, because frankly, the Global Existential Summit would not exist without you. Because way back when, I think that would have been 4 years, over 4 years ago now, we were collaborating on something. You were starting your amazing summits, and you said, "Oh, hey, Natalie, those conversations that you've been having with people, you should turn them into a summit." And it was very much you who supported and encouraged and showed me that that was a possibility. So always thank you so much for making that a reality, because just to backtrack, I guess, to what that is, the Global Existential Summits are online summits where I have had a conversation with people. I think there's over 80 different speakers over the 4 summits now, looking at what are existential ideas? How do we define them? How do we understand them? How have existential ideas contributed to their own research and their own work, maybe? How can existential ideas positively or negatively maybe impact humanity? How do existential ideas show up within the arts, in film, in literature, in music? Um, and it's a conversation that I think is ongoing. I think that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is an ongoing conversation that started from the first humans and will probably end with the last humans. And so these are just tiny little snapshots of tiny little fragments of that conversation. And they evolved because I studied existential philosophy for 4 years, and it was the same existential elite for 4 years. And I thought, what apart from what these white Western European dudes were saying, surely there must be other voices out there. Surely there must be contributions out there. So I did a little bit of Googling, and of course there are. There are so many amazing different existential contributions from speakers all around the world. And so what the existential summits do, based on that framework and that direction, that questioning, is that they interview different voices around the world looking at what existential ideas are and how they can inspire and heal humanity, really. And you said, where can they be found? They can be found from existentialofferings.com. The idea behind that being that we are all, just offering. All of these ideas are something that has been offered. Take it or leave it. Align it with yourself or just don't, and that's okay. Or the proper website is existentialsummit.com, but either will lead you to it, and it's free for everybody. And they take place in January and often a repeat in June of each year. The next one is January the 6th to the 10th, 2025.
Brilliant, brilliant. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you after this conversation, like, is there a way they can reach out?
Yes, on the Existential Offerings website, the contact page will take you to it, but the email address is hello@existentialofferings.com. And I would love to hear from you, but if I don't reply super immediately, please don't take it personally. I just I'm not always as efficient as I'd like to be on my emails because of this ridiculous passion or life I have of engaging in so many different pursuits. But always a pleasure to hear from you. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Natalie, you're doing brilliant work. I'm excited to see where you go. And yeah, just keep going strong and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Noel. It's been so lovely to be offered this space by you, and I really appreciate this time. So thank you. Thank you.